I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving them pension. I can't. There's good friends of mine out of the state. Well, he's divorced, you have to do his husband. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money. Because also means that the boss is your boss.
All right, and welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into the unions picked by Andrew. And I'm here to announce the winner for next week is Jacob Stoops. So, Jake, you are the winner. So shoot me an email. Tell me what your idea for next week's show is, and we will go from there. All right, so we're going to talk about organized crime, labor unions, and racketeering in the United States. It's all about power, profit, and control across the decades, right? And so throughout the 20th century, American organized crime, particularly Italian-American organized crime families, systematically infiltrated labor unions and labor-adjacent industries. And these labor rackets became one of the most stable, low-risk, and profitable revenue streams for organized crime, rivaling gambling, narcotics, and long-term value. And we're kind of going to examine how criminal organizations embed themselves into unions, how the rackets functioned structurally, and how revenue models evolved decade by decade in response to economical, political, and legal pressures. So why was labor unions the perfect racket? Well, labor unions represented power without visibility. Unlike street crime, labor racketeering offered predictable monthly income, legitimate fronts from contracts, dues, benefits, and etc., to political insulation, and minimal violence compared to other rackets. And this is why it worked so well. And organized crime didn't oppose unions ideologically. Instead, they co-opted them using union power to extract money from employers while claiming to represent the workers. And the Mafia's labor strategy relied on three very distinct principles. Number one, control the union leadership. You control the leadership, you control everything. If you control the access to labor, you control everything. And you control the consequences of noncompliance, meaning somebody gets their fucking legs broken. And the structural mechanics of labor racketeering followed repeatable patterns across different industries. Number one, union capture. Mob figures install compliant union officials through intimidation, bribery, or election rigging. Number two, employer extortion. Employers paid to avoid strikes, slow work downs, vandalism, and sabotage. Number three, no-show and no-work jobs. Companies were forced to place mob associates on payrolls who never went to work, no-show, or appeared but did nothing, no work. Number four, benefit fund skimming. Union pensions and health funds were looted through kickbacks, loans to mob businesses, and real estate fraud. And you have to look at what were the key unions and industries that they targeted, right? Because organized crime focused on industries where labor disruption was catastrophic, albeit construction, longshore and shipping, trucking, garment industry, hospitality and food services, and the most heavily infiltrated included the Teamsters Union, the ILA, which is the International Longshoremen's Association, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Unions, and the AFL-CIO was often indirectly impacted. And if we look at the decade-by-decade revenue models, it's crazy. So from the 1920s, Prohibition-era foundations of all of this, their primary income sources would have been bootlegging, protection via unions, control of dock workers and teamsters, strike manipulation and liquor distributions. And labor rackets were secondary but very strategic, and they were used to protect alcohol supply chains. And so the estimated labor union-related income was low to moderate, and their strategic value was infrastructure control. So then when you look at the 1930s, during the Great Depression, economic instability increased labor disputes, creating an opportunity for organized crime to step in. And then they began revenue streams of selling labor peace to struggling companies, installing mob-friendly union leaders, and extorting New Deal construction projects. And sort of the key shift that came with that was unions became profit centers, not just facilitators of what they were trying to do. Then you get into the 40s with wartime expansion. World War II created a massive industrial demand, and those revenue streams changed. They went from what we've already discussed to defense plant labor contracts, dock control for military shipping, and skimming war production payrolls. And the government largely ignored corruption to avoid production disruptions. It was easier for them to just pay and get everything done on time than to worry about it. And that income was very high, and their risk was minimal due to wartime priorities. And then when you get to the golden age of sort of racketeering is in the 1950s, and that was sort of the peak decade for this because the revenue stream became large-scale no-show jobs, construction kickbacks, pension fund manipulation, national trucking extortion, and unions were used to laundering money and exerting political influence. And mob families operated as shadow management companies or management firms for entire industries. We get to the 60s, public exposure and congressional scrutiny, and the McClellan committee hearings exposed widespread corruption. And so they had to adapt their revenue. And so they went to more discreet skimming, use of middlemen, and reduced violence. And labor rackets remained lucrative, but they became a little bit more sophisticated. And then you move into the 70s with the institutionalized corruption. Despite exposure, rackets would persist. Revenue streams were long-term construction contracts, control of municipal projects, real estate development kickbacks, and mob-controlled unions functioned like a private tax authority on development. And then you step into the 80s and you have the RICO and then the decline. And the introduction of the RICO Act changed enforcement, and the revenues began to trend differently. Sharp decline in visibility, increased use of shell companies. Look at the gas tax scam as sort of an example of that. And the continued pension fund looting and high-profile prosecutions would dismantle a lot of that structure. And then you go through the 1990s, you have trustees and federal oversight, major unions were placed under court supervision, revenue streams became residual no-show jobs, legacy construction influence, consulting kickbacks, and labor racketeering was no longer dominant, but it was still present. And when you look from the 2000s up until today, it's fragmented and residual because traditional mafia influence declined and was replaced by smaller regional crime groups, white-collar labor fraud, and non-union contractor corruption. And so labor racketeering today resembles sort of more corporate fraud more than classic mafia extortion. And the reason why labor racketeering was so profitable was because unlike narcotics or gambling, labor rackets offered reoccurring income, low violence, legal camouflage, and political leverage. And a single union could generate millions of dollars annually with minimal operational costs. And so when we look at labor racketeering, it was not an accessory crime. It was central to organized crime's economic power for much of the 20th century. And while law enforcement successes weakened traditional mafia control, the underlying vulnerabilities of all of that, albeit concentrated labor power, opaque benefit funds, and political protection, still remain relevant today, but it's not the same. And understanding those rackets is essential to not only studying organized crime, but to understanding how corruption embeds itself inside legitimate institutions. And so I wanted to look at a couple of different people. Look at Jimmy Hoffa in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In the background, just a very quick one, is Jimmy Hoffa rose from Detroit labor organizer to the most powerful union leader in American history. And under that leadership, the Teamsters controlled over 2 million workers, giving Hoffa leverage over trucking, shipping, manufacturing, and retail supply chains. And the Teamsters were not infiltrated by organized crime against Hoffa's will. They were strategically aligned. There's a difference. And so what's the what's the racket structure? Well, they used pension funds as a bank. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund became the de facto mob investment vehicle. Loans were issued to mob-connected developers, minimal oversight, high returns through kickbacks, not interest, and the money flowed into Las Vegas casinos, Florida real estate, and Midwest construction. And mob families didn't need to rob banks. They borrowed from the workers' retirement funds. And a second sort of structure is labor peace for profit. And companies would pay to ensure that there were no strikes, no hijackings, no accidents. And truckers who did not cooperate found their cargo missing, their routes disrupted, or their contracts revoked. And the third point to this is political power as protection, because Hoffa delivers votes, right? And when Hoffa delivers the votes, the politicians would in turn deliver regulatory blindness, federal prosecution, and slow prosecutions. And this was not corruption. It was not corruption in isolation. It was a system of mutual dependency. They needed each other. And ultimately, as we know, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and fraud, and his later disappearance cemented the legend. But the real damage was done earlier. The normalization of criminal control over a national union was the big thing. And so what about Anthony Scotto? Anthony Scotto in the New York waterfront. And the background is that Anthony Scotto was president of the local International Longshoremen's Association and a captain in the Gambino crime family. And the waterfront was perfect because it represented high cash flow, perishable goods, tight schedules, and enormous leverage. And that racket structure was control of labor equaled control of commerce. And if Scotto said a ship didn't unload, it didn't unload. And what importers paid for was to avoid delays, prevent theft, and to keep schedules intact. And a single stall ship could cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars per day. The second facet to that particular racket structure was no-show jobs. Shipping companies were forced to put mob associates on payrolls as port consultants, safety inspectors, or supervisors. And many of them never stepped a single foot on a fucking dock. And the third sort of parameter to this was skimming at scale. Money flowed upward through union dues, employee kickbacks, and construction contracts tied to expansion. And so the outcome of all of that was Anthony Scotto was convicted in the late 70s of extensive wiretap evidence. His downfall exposed how organized crime effectively ran the New York waterfront for decades. And the third guy I want to look at is Tony Anastasio, who, as we know, was Albert Anastasia's brother. And he was a Genovese family powerhouse and the brother of Albert. And while Albert was known for violence, Tony specialized in administration, labor control, and profit extraction. And that particular racket structure was dock worker domination, because Anastasio controlled hiring halls, shift assignments, promotion pathways, and the dock workers knew obey or they wouldn't work, or talk or you disappear from the roster. The second facet of that was theft as a policy. Cargo theft wasn't random, it was scheduled. There were specific containers that would get flagged. The goods would be redistributed through mob-owned businesses. Thank you for your music, you fucking asshole. And labor union used to move stolen goods, swag. And the third facet of this was political insulation. The docks were considered too critical to disrupt, and authorities tolerated corruption because commerce would flow, labor peace would stay maintained, and the violence was almost minuscule. And so Anastasio's influence declined with federal waterfront reforms, but his model, control labor first and money will follow, became the standard across which every mob operation used nationwide. And so what's the comparative analysis? And what do these three particular sort of cases show? Well, across Hoffa, Scotto, and Anastasio, the same principles appear over and over and over again. Unions were not victims, they were infrastructure. The mob didn't hijack unions randomly. They targeted unions that controlled choke points, touched money constantly, and had political insulation. And the second part of that was violence was the backup plan. Most rackets relied on fear, reputation, and economic pressure. And actual violence was, believe it or not, actually rare. And therefore, it was more effective when it was used. The third part was the money was long-term. Unlike street crime, there's no need for daily scores, income renewed monthly, and risk was distributed. And labor racketeering was organized crime version of passive income. And so why does those sort of cases we talk about still matter? Well, they matter because modern labor corruption lacks mob nicknames and headlines, but benefit fund fraud, contractor kickbacks, union political entanglements all descend directly from those systems. The names changed, but the incentives didn't. And then you move towards the New York construction cartel, which was a big facet of mob rackets. They controlled concrete contracts and costs from the 70s to the 90s. And for over 20 years, the New York scale large construction industry operated under a criminal cartel controlled by the city's Italian-American mafia families. And that system, as obviously as we know, was the Concrete Club. That was not street-level extortion. That was industrialized market control enforced through union suppliers and organized bid rigging. And the cartel inflated construction costs across New York City by hundreds of millions of dollars, embedding organized crime into the literal foundations of the city. And here's the families that were involved. The cartel was coordinated through the commission and enforced by all New York crime families, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, and the Colombos. And each family controlled specific union, companies, or geographic zones, but no major concrete job proceeded without the commission's approval. And the reason why construction was such a perfect racket for organized crime was construction had four critical advantages to organized crime: massive dollar amounts, projects worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, complex cost structures, easy to hide kickbacks, union choke points, and public funding. Taxpayers unknowingly subsidized the racket. And concrete was vulnerable because it has to be poured on schedule. Delays destroy structural integrity. And once poured, corruption is invisible. And so the Concrete Club controlled New York projects involving concrete over a certain threshold, commonly cited at $2 million plus. And how did that work? Well, only cartel-approved concrete suppliers could bid. Winning bids were pre-selected. Losing bidders submitted intentionally higher bids. Developers paid 2 to 7% kickback of the total project cost. And this was not, optional participation. Noncompliance meant labor stoppages, supply delays, permit issues, vandalism or arson, financial ruin. And the role of the labor unions was that the Concrete Club relied on mob-influenced locals tied to concrete workers, teamsters, operating engineers, laborers, and union power would ensure that work stoppages were on command, overtime, abuse, mandatory no-show jobs, and enforced silence. Unions just were not the tools. They were enforcement mechanisms that the mob used. And who paid the price? Well, private developers, the city and state governments, taxpayers, legitimate contractors who were locked out of bidding. They're the ones that suffered. And studies would later estimate that the cartel activity inflated New York City construction costs by 30% during its peak years. And then, as we know, in the 80s and early 90s, the commission case came, and the construction cartel ended because of RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, and construction industry inside flipping. And key cases dismantled bid rigging rings and sent high-ranking figures to prison, particularly within the Genovese and Gambino crime family. And the system, not just the individuals, were put on trial. And so what does the money look like, right? Because that, to me, is the most fascinating part about this. And what I actually did was I went through a lot of stuff, and I have all the numbers. And here's the way it would work. So the public and the private developer would hand down the contract funds, and the commission would approve the construction company. Okay, then they would inflate the project costs. That would lead to kickbacks, no-show jobs, overbilling, mafia families, mob associates, and slush funds. Then it would flow down to commission-level distribution. Then it would flow down to captains, union officials, and political fixers. And so where the money actually ended up? Well, they ended up in mafia families, direct cash payments, long-term income streams, and low exposure compared to drugs or gambling. The union officials got payoffs for cooperation, protection from reform, and personal enrichment. Politicians and inspectors got campaign contributions, bribes, and regulatory inaction. Developers, ironically, paid kickbacks, still made profits, and passed costs to buyers and taxpayers. And the reason why it was so hard to kill was because even after the arrest, buildings were already standing, contracts already were executed, evidence was already buried in accounting, and witnesses financially were compromised. And so the cartel didn't need secrecy, it relied on mutual silence. And it matters because this wasn't mobsters shaking down contractors. It was parallel economic systems, a criminal price-setting authority, a privately enforced tax on development, and it functioned for decades inside legitimate capitalism. And so when you look at the New York construction or the concrete club specifically, they had a lot of command and coordination. And at the top of New York's construction racket sat the commission, which we know all about, and they functioned as a cartel board of directors. No major disputes, no supply changes, or enforcement actions occurred without the commission saying it was okay. And so during the peak years of the concrete club, early 70s to early 90s, key power centers included Paul Castellano, Gambino boss central to the concrete and construction oversight, Anthony Salerno, Genovese front boss, control labor rackets and trucking, Phil Rusty Rastelli, Bonanno boss involved in labor influence, even though he was ultimately not charged at the end of the day. Carmine Persico, Colombo boss, controlled union link enforcement, and Vic Amuso, later Lucchese boss, construction and labor muscle. And the commission's interest was not day-to-day management, but profit stability and disputes prevention more than anything. And so the capo layer, where was construction enforced and by who? And actual control happened at the capo regime level, men who interfaced directly with contractors, union locals, and suppliers. And key construction link captains and power brokers were these men, Anthony Corallo, Tony Dux. And it was in a sort of an earlier period. He controlled construction and trucking influence. Matty Madonna, later on construction and labor rackets. Peter Gotti oversaw labor-linked rackets. Anthony Pacquione, construction company front involvement. Ralph Scopo, we've all heard of Ralph Scopo and how smart he was. He controlled concrete labor unions, pivotal concrete club figure. And these men ensured that the commission approved contractors won bids, union local officials enforced compliance, and kickbacks were delivered on schedule. And failure to cooperate rarely required overt violence because economic death was sufficient. And when you look at union enforcement arms in New York City, construction unions were the cartel's enforcement mechanism. The concrete workers locals, Teamster locals controlling material transport, operation engineers locals controlling heavy equipment, and union officials aligned with the mob captains. And they agreed that they could shut down jobs instantly when they wanted, demand additional fees mid-project, and force hiring of no-show workers. And so one of the things you might wonder is, well, wow, all of these things New York did with labor racketeering, well, how did that work in Chicago? Well, there were some structural differences. And the thing is, you have to understand something. In New York, there's 5 crime families. In Chicago, there was just one. So that's a difference right there. The governing body in New York was a commission-based concrete club. And in Chicago, they just had more centralized boss authority. So they had one man calling it instead of 5, right? You look at New York, they were really into bid rigging and union enforcement, whereas Chicago had direct control of the unions and contractors themselves. So Chicago went right to the source, whereas the New York mob sort of stayed on the fringe of that. And the style of New York was corporate cartel, and the style of Chicago was authoritarian monopoly. So they functioned 2 different ways. And if you look at Chicago's construction rackets, their model, it was dominated, obviously, by the Chicago outfit, and it was a vertically integrated criminal enterprise. And key figures would have been Sam Giancana, an early consolidation of labor power, Tony Accardo, long-term strategic control, Joe Iuppa, oversaw labor rackets and skimming, Jackie the Lackey, Jackie Cerrone, day-to-day enforcement. And unlike New York, Chicago did not share power. And the outfit controlled construction unions, material suppliers, contract licensing, municipal inspectors. And so how did Chicago make money differently? Well, under the New York model, percentage-based kickbacks, 2 to 7%, in some cases 10%, bid rigging among multiple companies, and commission arbitration between organized crime families here in New York. The Chicago model was different because they had fixed price extortion per job rather than 2 to 5% on the totality. They were adding percentages per actual job. They also approved, they only chose contractors that were approved by the boss of Chicago. And they also used direct threats and union shutdowns. And Chicago favored simplicity and fear over cartel-style coordination. And when you look at violence versus subtlety, with New York, violence was rare. Economic pressure dominated what they were doing, and a lot of it was white-collar camouflage. Whereas in Chicago, violence was very credible. Union officials openly intimidated contractors, and there was less concern about media exposure. And so why did New York last longer than Chicago? Well, New York's system survived longer because it disrupted risk across families. It hid inside bureaucratic complexity, and it blended corruption with legitimate businesses. And so Chicago's centralized model, while powerful, at one point, once federal cases hit leadership, the entire system collapsed and quickly, because you have one man you have to take down in New York, 5 different families. So it's a big difference. And so when you look at the comparative money flow, and I'll make it very simple, you have New York. Developer leads to cartel contractor, to kickbacks, leads to families, leads to the commission. In Chicago, developer to an outfit approved construction contractor, back to the outfit, back to the boss. And so when you look at the two different cities, they are differently in the way that they functioned, but it's the same goddamn outcome, because both cities taxed construction invisibly. They both weaponized unions. They both inflated public costs. They both converted labor power into criminal profits. And the difference between the two is just how they governed. The morality was no difference. They just governed differently. New York built the boardroom and Chicago built a throne. That's the difference. New York built a boardroom, Chicago built a throne. And so when you look at sort of the myth of union only, the public's understanding of the mafia, especially of mafia economics, often overemphasizes union control, obscuring how deeply embedded organized crime became in gambling, construction, real estate, finance, extortion, consumer fraud. And the reality is those rackets often generated higher margins and lower visibility, say than labor racketeering being essential to the mafia's long-term resilience. And the 5 families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, operated as diversified criminal conglomerates rather than single racket organizations. But let's be honest. When we're talking about rackets, really the core cash engine is gambling for the mob. That is the single most reliable cash generator for the New York Mafia. And its primary forms, numbers rackets, bookmaking, sports betting, high-stakes card games, daily cash intake allowed families to pay soldiers weekly, bribe police, and fund other rackets. And the Genovese crime family was particularly dominant, favoring low-profile operations that minimized violence and publicity. And then you get to casino skimming and offshore gambling. And while New York lacked legal casinos until the late mid-century or late into the century, mafia families skimmed profits from out-of-state casinos, Caribbean gambling operations, offshore betting systems. And cash was removed before accounting, making prosecution insanely difficult. Obviously, they move into construction and real estate. And even outside of union control, mob families profited heavily from ownership stakes and manipulation in real estate. And their method was silent partnerships and development firms, inflated subcontracting, property flipping using insider access, mortgage and insurance fraud. And mob figures often use shell companies to distance themselves from ownership, allowing them to profit without coercion. You get into loan sharking and credit rackets, high interest lending. Loan sharking provided immediate liquidity, leverage over borrowers, and entry points into legitimate businesses. And interest rates, exceeded 5% per week. And they were enforced through reputation rather than constant violence. And borrowers included small business owners, gamblers, contractors, and restaurateurs. And failure to pay resulted in forced business takeovers, converting debt into equity. The other one, extortion and business protection. And the protection rackets, the mafia monetized fear through monthly insurance payments, vendor monopolies, mandatory suppliers, and industries were targeted like nightclubs, waste hauling, garment manufacturing, and wholesale food markets. And the genius of the system was that violence was rare but always credible, meaning it could happen. Then you move into waste management and carding. And the garbage business became a quasi-monopoly controlled through cartel agreements, revenue model, price fixing among haulers, forced contracts, kickbacks for route access. And that racket really thrived because, let's be honest, waste removal is mandatory. Contracts renew automatically. Oversight was fragmented. And carting provided steady income with minimal public visibility. And carting, Tony Dux Carallo and Joey Massino, two of the biggest carting industry guys ever. They got involved in stock fraud and financial crimes, boiler rooms and market manipulation. From the 70s onward, the Mafia increasingly turned to financial fraud, pump and dump schemes, penny stock manipulation, insider trading through corrupt brokers. And those schemes offered high upside, rapid cash flow, and lower street level exposure. They moved into counterfeiting, theft, and black markets. And some of their major operations there would have been cigarette bootlegging, luxury goods counterfeiting, cargo theft, and auto theft rings. And New York's ports and airports made it an ideal hub for interstate and international theft operations. Narcotics, they had that. And while, somewhat discouraged, drug trafficking was tolerated. Heroin and cocaine distribution generated enormous profits. Families enforced internal taxes on dealers. And they had plausible deniability, protected leadership. The Bonanno and Lucchese families were particularly active in that area. Then you move into political corruption and influence peddling. Money flowed through bribes to inspectors, payoff to local politicians, influence over zoning permits. And rather than, buying policy, the Mafia bought predictability, ensuring that problems would never arise. And why are all of those rackets so effective? Well, compared to unions, those operations required less public exposure. It generated faster returns. It scaled easily, adapted quickly to law enforcement pressure. But most importantly, they blurred the line between criminal and legitimate enterprises, delaying detection. And so then you have the decline and transformation. And as the RICO law sort of gets put into effect, it's combined with long-term wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and asset forfeiture. And that significantly weakened those revenue streams by the 1990s. However, the methods, not the mindset, survived, reappearing today in white-collar crime, fraud, and regulatory capture. And so let's look at a couple other things. Construction, adjacent public contracts, non-union. And these are things you guys might not have ever thought about. Street lights, snow removal, maintenance, municipal services, all controlled by the mob. And why is that ranked number one of all the things? Public money, automatic renewals, inflated invoices, minimal scrutiny, and no victim complaining. And a single mob-connected maintenance company could quietly skim millions of dollars per year. And that racket thrived under families like the Genovese crime family and the Chicago outfit. And if you look at the profit profile of all of that, very high, long-term, low violence, and extremely durable. The number two is waste management, carting, and recycling. And that included cardboard. Oh, God, I could tell a story about some cardboard shit you guys would not believe, but I'm not. Somebody remind me next week to tell that story, because there was an issue here with me and some people with cardboard shit. Anyway, and the reason why that's ranked number two as the highest profit margin for them is it's mandatory service, price fixing, route monopolies, and contract lock-ins. Garbage money never stops, even during recessions. And by the 1980s, carting rackets generated tens of millions of dollars annually for New York City alone. And that profit profile was high, predictable, and difficult en route. The number three was gambling, numbers, bookmaking, and sports betting. And it ranks number three because it's daily cash flow, massive volume, low overhead, and scalable citywide. And the Genovese crime family protected this model by running gambling like retail banking, small bets, and high volume. And that profit profile was high, cash heavy, and requires constant management. Number four is real estate manipulation and zoning. I don't know if you guys were aware they're into zoning. Air rights, rezoning, and insider flips. And why it ranks four is one rezoning equals millions and millions and millions of dollars. It also has extremely low exposure, and it looks legitimate visually. Lower frequency, but massive single event profits. There was a very high upside to that. The negative would have been it's sort of inconsistent, but it's extremely discreet. Number 5 would be stock fraud and financial crimes. Huge short-term upside, fast money, higher legal risk, and that became popular post 1970s as more traditional rackets sort of declined. The problem is it was less sustainable, it was higher exposure, but higher bursts of cash. Wholesale food and produce distribution. Think Frank Cali and Paul Castellano here. Markets, warehouses, and vendors. Why? Well, the daily volume was huge. The thin margins, so there was easy pressure. And the spoilage risk gives them leverage. It wasn't glamorous, but it had citywide reach. And that profits were medium to high. It was a stable thing to do, but it was labor intensive. Then you have number 7, loan sharking and business takeovers. I'm giving you the rundown of all the rackets, folks. And the reason why loan sharking and business takeovers worked was because there was high interest rates, business seizure potential, and requires enforcement credibility. And it was often used as a gateway racket to acquire legitimate funds. High profit per target. However, it was on a smaller scale and it requires a crime family to intimidate people. The 8th most selective cash flow that they had was coin-operated machines, jukeboxes, vending, and pinball. Not slot machines. The reason why this was good for them was small money, but a huge volume, low visibility, and excellent laundering vehicle. And Chicago perfected that racket. Very low risk, medium money, but it declined with digital payments, credit cards, and et cetera, et cetera. The 9th most congruent way they made money is healthcare and medical billing fraud. Why? Well, it's government money. It's a paper crime, and it's high payouts until those audits hit. And that became more sort of common in the last 10 years. And that profit profile was medium to high, but it was time limited, and you risked being audited. The 10th most profitable was cargo theft and black market redistribution. Think ports, airports, and trucking. They were high one-time payouts, dependent on access, higher law enforcement attention. It was profitable, but it could be volatile at the same time. Let's see, number 11, nightclub, bathroom, and venue concessions. Bathroom attendants, mob controlled. Bet you didn't know that. Vending and tips. Why? Cash only. Zero paperwork. Citywide scale. Low per venue earnings, but incredibly clean. It was low risk. It was low to medium profits, ultra low risk, and it was fucking invisible. 12, funeral homes and burial logistics. Cemeteries, transport, and services. Why? Well, they have emotional leverage. It's cash heavy and it's quiet influence. And it's steady because everybody fucking dies, but it has limited growth. Low to medium money. It's a stable, but it's a narrow market because you can only control one. It's not like you can control a fleet of them. So let me look at this because I have. Okay, so I'll take you 1 through 12, right? All right. These are the most 12 profitable rackets. Number 1, public contracts. Profit level, massive. Longevity, very long. Waste and recycling. Profit level, massive, very long. Gambling. Profit level, high, long. Real estate, level high. Longevity, mid. Stock fraud, somewhat profitable, short term. Food distribution, somewhat profitable, long term. Loan sharking, profitable, medium. Coin machines, profitable, long term. Healthcare fraud, short term, not as much profit. Cargo theft, not as much profit, short term. Nightclubs, some profit, long term. Funerals, long term, a little profit. So the most predictable mob rackets, believe it or not, were actually boring. You would think that some of the more glamorous mob rackets brought in the most money, but that's not true. Because the most profitable mob rackets that were boring was contracts, garbage, maintenance, paperwork, bureaucracy, and the Mafia didn't chase excitement. They chose reoccurring revenue with plausible deniability. This is what a lot of drug dealers don't get. They want the $100 million a year. They want the $20 million a year. I would take $20 million over a 5-year period because the money's constantly coming instead of a lump sum. That's how fuckers get caught. Make your money, but at a slow pace. You don't have to be able to buy the cigarette boat next month. You understand what I mean? So let's look at the money. How much did the mob make off all of these rackets? Well, off public contracts and municipal services, which includes snow removal, maintenance, traffic signals, and streetlights, New York Mafia was pulling in $30 to $60 million a year, spread across dozens of shell companies, and they inflated the invoices from 20 to 50%. This is just one racket, public contracts and municipal services, 30 to 60 million. Chicago, they earn 10 to 25 million a year doing the same thing. However, they had tighter control than New York did, and they had fewer contracts. And so you might say, well, why is it so fucking high? Well, it's taxpayer funded. It's auto renewable, and there's almost no whistleblowers. Well, what about waste management? Keep in mind, this is per fucking racket. This is going to blow your mind, the money. Waste management, carting, and recycling. New York Mafia pulled in $25 to $40 million a year just on waste management, carting, and recycling. And at the peak, the mob's influence touched 80% of private carting routes. Chicago, they made between $8 and $15 million a year, and that excluded the union skim. But this was pure route control and price fixing only. So right away, even if we take the middle road of public contracts, 30 to 60, and make it 40, that's legitimately almost $80 million off two rackets alone. And I'm not going to keep adding it up. You guys can just make a mental note. Okay. The third racket, gambling, numbers, bookmaking, and sports betting, non-casino. New York, $20 to $50 million a year. Numbers alone on their own pulled in $5 to $10 million a year. So New York pulled in 20 to 50 million a year. Chicago, 15 to 30 million a year. And the estimates will vary because volume depended on sports season, enforcement pressure, and economic cycles. The fourth racket, real estate manipulation and zoning. New York City, $10 to $30 million a year. It was highly uneven. Even some years were more massive than others. Some were quiet, but 10 to 30 million. Chicago, 5 million to 12 million per year. But the difference was Chicago was smart. They didn't put a cap on 5% of all construction rackets or real estate sort of transactions. What they did was they used low frequencies. They wanted $2 to $5 million per deal. So the New York mob might take 6% of 15 different things. Not Chicago. Chicago says, no, you're going to pay us $2 to $5 million per fucking deal we do. Interesting. Stock fraud and financial crimes. New York City, 10 to 25 million a year, especially through the late 70s and the 90s. Chicago, 3 to 8 million per year. Wholesale food and produce distribution. New York City, $8 to $15 million a year. Fulton Fish Market, produce hubs were critical nodes. So imagine what Frank Cali was pulling in on his own. I would say $30 million by himself. Easy. With the companies he owned and whatever. And so New York was pulling in 8 to 15 million per year on wholesale food. Think about what Paul Castellano was pulling in. Chicago, $4 to $7 million a year. Loan sharking and business takeovers. New York City, 5 to 10 million a year. Chicago, 3 to 6 million per year. Coin operated machines. New York City, 4 to 7 million a year. We're talking about jukeboxes, pinball machines. Chicago, 5 to 10 million per year, because Chicago really dominated this specific racket. And they had thousands of locations and small weekly skims. What about healthcare and medical billing fraud? Well, New York City pulled in 5 million to 15 million per year in short bursts. Chicago, $2 to $6 million a year. What about the cargo theft and black market distribution? Well, New York City pulled in 5 million to 12 million per year, including the ports, airports, and trucking hubs. Chicago, 4 to 8 million a year. And the difference between the two is that New York relied on the unions, whereas Chicago had to deal with corrupt insiders and enforcement cycles. What about nightclub, bathroom, venue, and concessions? Well, New York City pulled in from $1 to $3 million a year doing that. Chicago, $500,000 to 1.5 per year. And that's the cleanest money. Impossible to trace. Oh, what about funeral homes and burial logistics? Well, New York pulled in 1 million to 2 million a year. Chicago pulled in 500,000 to 1 million per year. So, what are the city totals, non-union and lesser known rackets only? And if we look at New York during their peak years, they were legit pulling in from 125 million to 250 million dollars a year. Chicago, $60 million a year to 120 million per year. And those figures exclude union skims, casino skimming, narcotics, and major construction cartel kickbacks. Those are just the simplified stuff. So for New York, up to 250 million a year, Chicago 120. And if you add those back in, the ones the fact that we excluded union skims, casino skimming, narcotics, and major construction cartel kickbacks, we removed that. But if we put that back in, the New York City mob's total economy exceeded $500 million to $1 billion a year between 1970s and the 1980s. That is fucking insane. And so oh, what was that? Hold on a minute. Sorry about that, guys. You know, I don't know why this phone does this. I don't give a fuck what's on Spotify. Suck my crank. All right, so who personally earned what? You guys didn't think I was going to go there, did you? So who earned what during those peak years? Well, Anthony Salerno's at the top of that list. From gambling to karting to construction, estimated personal income he made from 1970 to 1980 was pulling in $15 million a year on his own. Sources of income would have been gambling, numbers, garbage, karting, cartel, enforcement, construction, kickbacks, non-union, non-overlap. Salerno was a goddamn revenue aggregator. Money flowed to him from dozens of captains and everything else. That's why when Tony Salerno died, he was worth $2 billion on his own. Well, what about Paul Castellano? Well, between those years, he made $10 million, a rough estimate, $10 million a year with construction, food, and real estate. His sources were silent ownership and construction firms, wholesale meat and food distribution, real estate, flips, and zoning plays. So that's 10 times 10, that's $100 million easily just there, just with those construction, food, and real estate. That's not counting the 60s or the fucking, that's just the 70s to the 80s. And one of the things Castellano did was he avoided street rackets, and his income looked more like a corporate executive. What about Vinny Gigante? Well, between gambling, loan sharking, and finance, he was pulling in $8 million a year. Between gambling, loan sharking, and financial fraud approvals. And one of the key traits about Vinny Gigante was low visibility, steady income over explosive rackets. He chose something that he knew was guaranteed. And you got to remember, late 60s is when he kind of took over. So that went from the 60s to the 90s until he killed over. That's fucking insane. What about Carlo Gambino? And this is at the earlier peak, right? This would have been this just 1960 through 1970. Carlo Gambino was pulling in $7 million a year just on dock-related commerce, construction interests, and gambling. Now, if you do the inflation, that's fucking huge. So let's see. Hold on a minute. How much was $7 million worth in 1960?
Here's what I found.
All right. Well, I don't know why she sounds fucking Irish, but let's hold on. Just give me 1 minute here. 7 million in 19, what did we say, 60? Oops, it would help if I add a fucking zero to that. Jesus Christ. Okay. So according to this, $7 million in 1960 would be $76 million today. Okay. 7 million in 1960 was worth 650,472. So it was $76 million. And he did that for 10 years. So we'll go 76. All right. right, so hold on a second. 76 million times 10. So is that $760 million? Almost $1 billion. Almost $1 billion in 10 years, which, if you do the math, seems right. So let's look at powerful captains where the real cash was made. Ralph Scopo was making $6 million a year just from the concrete club alone on his own. He earned more than some of the bosses did because he sat directly on the cash spigot. And that was concrete labor enforcement, construction kickbacks, and no-show schemes. What about Paul Vario? He was making, just off cargo theft, gambling, and loan sharking, $4 million a year. What about Anthony Corallo? $5 million a year. Keep in mind, this is over a 10-year period. So that's $50 million. What about Carmine Galante? He was making $8 million a year. And Galante was one of the highest individual earners, but also the most reckless of the bunch. And that was narcotics and loan sharking. So let's look at Chicago, just for comparison. Tony Accardo made $20 million a year beginning in the 1960s. Gambling, construction, coin-operated machines, Las Vegas skimming. And the difference from New York was that Accardo kept more money personally due to centralized control. What about Joe Iuppa? $10 million a year in construction, Vegas skimming, union-style or union-adjacent enforcement. And what about mid-level captains and crews, like the quiet millionaires? Well, a typical New York captain in a strong crew makes $3 million, between $1 and $3 million a year in New York City. A typical soldier in a top crew earns $150,000 to $500,000 a year. And those figures exceeded legitimate executive pay at the time. And so what's a summary table? What's a peak annual personal earnings? Well, Ricardo per year made $20 million. Salerno up to $15 million a year. Castellano $10 million a year. Vinny Gigante $8 million a year. Galante $8 million. Ralph Scopo $6 million. Paul Vario $4 million. And this is just from the 1970s to the 1980s, and we're not talking about inflation. We've already done the math on the inflation. It's a shitload of money. And so if you want to do a very rough estimate of this, you multiply 5x times 2025. So $10 million a year. Okay. And who do we, let's say Vinny Gigante, right? That's actually $50 million a year in those days, right? And a $3 million a year captain really is $15 million a year today. So if we look, it anywhere from $80 to $100 million, Tony Accardo, anything, wow, it's just a fucking insane amount of money. It just is a fucking insane amount of money. These guys just all were just swimming in it. So let's look at the Genovese crime family. Gambling in numbers, Fat Tony Salerno and Vinny Gigante. We're pulling in $50 million, just the two of them. Numbers, bookmaking, gambling clubs, and low-key shit. Look at loan sharking and finance. Vinny Gigante and Matty Madonna pulling in a combined $14 million just in loans, debt conversion, and small financial fraud. Carding and waste. Anthony Tux Corallo, in coordination with the Lucchese Street Crews. We're talking $20 million a year. Keep in fact the time period. Real estate construction, Paul Vario, $12 million. In shell construction company, zoning, flips, and trucking. And so the total family's earnings during that 10-year gap was up to $62 million a year. What about the Gambinos? Well, if you look at construction and subcontracting, Paul Castellano and Pete Gotti, $16 million a year. Non-union construction, subcontractor, kickbacks, and trucking. When you look at wholesale food and distribution, various captains in meat and produce, up to $11 million in meat packing produce. Keep in mind, this is a 10-year stretch. Gambling in numbers, $8 million. And this came from soldiers and captains. Cargo theft from various associates, $10 million. So their earnings during that time period was anywhere between $15 to $30 million a year. And that's less money than the Genovese crime family. The Genovese crime family almost doubled them. What about the Lucchese's? Well, you have trucking and materials crew. Anthony Corallo and Paul Vario were pulling in $12 million a year between trucks, concrete materials, and supply chains. Gambling and loan sharking crew, mid-tier captains and soldiers, $8 million a year in numbers, high-stakes poker and loan sharking. Construction and real estate, various construction-focused captains, $6 million a year. Their total earnings in that 10-year gap was $10 to $17 million a year. And the Lucchese's were more logistic-heavy, controlling trucking and materials, often subcontracting with Genovese and Gambino crews. And what about the Bonanos? Well, between the loan shark and narcotics, Carmine Galante, $12 million a year. Gambling, $6 million. Construction crews, associates only $4 million. So they were pulling in $7 to $15 million a year. And Bonanno earned the most through high-risk narcotics, but had fewer construction ties. And what about the Colombos? Well, construction and concrete crews, Yes, concrete and construction crews, Ralph Scopo, anywhere between 3 and 6. And that included concrete club enforcement and contractor kickbacks. Gambling and loan sharking, soldiers and mid-level captains pulled in $4 million, between 1 and 3, $4 million. Carting and waste crew at the street level, associates, $1 to $2 million, making it 3. Garbage route enforcement, etc. The total family earnings for the Colombos were $5 million to $11 million a year in that decade. Smaller than the Gambino or Genovese crime family, but still highly lucrative per captain. So, what is the approximate New York City five-family total earnings, non-union and lesser-known rackets? Well, the Genovese crime family, $62 million. Gambino, $26. The Lucchese's, $17. The Bonanos, $15. And the Colombos, $11 million. And the citywide total, $175 to $130 million a year. If you divided it all up together, that's the average. The average was $75 to $130 million per family. However, the Genoveses are just kicking everybody's ass. And those figures exclude union, skims, casinos, narcotics, beyond the Bonanno Galante operations. Add those and peak New York City mob earnings, they will exceed $500 million a year. The soldier level economics, you guys have always asked me, what does the average soldier make? Well, here you go, $1 to $3 million. Captains, soldiers, $150,000 to $500,000 a year. Associates, $50,000 to $150,000 a year. And for comparison, let's look at Chicago. I hope you guys are enjoying this. Chicago, gambling and bookmaking, $15 to $25 million a year. And the key figures in that would be Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana. Construction and carting, $10 million to $15 million, run by Joe Iuppa. Coin-operated machines, $5 to $10 million. Outfit associates, cargo and theft, $4 to $8 million. Mid-tier bosses. And Chicago bosses pocketed a higher percentage of revenue personally, whereas New York families distributed more via the commission system. And so what's the takeaway? Well, the New York City Genovese crews dominated gambling, carting, and loan sharking. Gambino crews led to construction and wholesale food distribution. The Lucchese crews controlled trucking and material supply. The Bonanno crews were high risk, high reward, narcotics heavy. Colombo crews focused on concrete and smaller gambling operations. Soldiers and captains were millionaires relative to average Americans, even without union involvement. So I'm going to go crazy and do something here. Tony Salerno, 2 main revenue streams in Rackets from 65 to 87. This is what he pulled in per year from 1965 to 1987. Dock control, $12 million a year, just from docks. From the garment district, $5 million a year. From illegal gambling, $4 million a year. Loan sharking, $3 million a year. Labor influence, $2 million a year. Other investments, $2 million a year. So 12, let's see, what do we got? 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 26. So that's $28 million in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on only 6 rackets. So, and that racket those are just a select. So give me 1 second. Let me crunch the numbers just to show you how insane this is. 19. Okay, hold on. 1987 minus 1965. So that's 22 years. And what did we say? 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 28 million. 28 times 22 years. Okay, so just off of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rackets, okay, from 1965 to 87. And this is not counting for fucking inflation. Just off those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rackets, he was pulling in $616 million on his own. On his own. And those are only 6 rackets. And listen, I don't even want to do the fucking inflation of that. We're talking billions of dollars. And of course, you know, you got to look at the reality of inflation, and you have to look at the reality of kicking up, because Tony Salerno 1000% was kicking up, but we're talking about $616 million in 22 years. That's $28 million a year. That's $30 million a year just off those 6 rackets. And that doesn't count the concrete club. You know, it doesn't count a lot of the other, it doesn't count the illegitimate shit that he owned and controlled. And so when people often say to me, oh, Tony Salerno wasn't all that, I laugh. Like, I think it was that idiot, that fucking British cocksucker. What's his fucking name? Who does the mob shit. I can't even think of this prick's name. Horrible show. He tried to say that Tony Salerno was a dumb guy. O.C. Shorts is that limey prick's name. He said Tony Salerno wasn't very bright. Really? You got to be incredibly bright to make $616 million fucking dollars by yourself. That's why I don't like O.C. Shorts. That, and he defends fucking rats. Fuck him and everybody that looks like him. Go fuck the queen, you dunce. Anyway, that's going to be it for the Rackets and Union shows. I hope you guys got something out of it. I know I did. When I was doing this research, I was very excited to finally get the numbers I wanted. It was, you guys don't have any clue of the shit I went through to get these numbers. Like, it's not a matter of just like clicking a button. Oh, there it is. Like, we're talking probably 16 hours on the phone and FOIA requests and you know, some other stuff I can do and talking to old heads and stuff like that. Name me another mob content creator that's doing that. Name me fucking one. None of them. I don't think any of them put any effort into this show if they can't get it from fucking Wikipedia. That's how I feel about it. All right, so that's it. Please do me a solid. Number one, be safe this weekend. Be good to one another. Be kind to somebody. Find something to laugh about. And do me a favor. Reach out to us at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Let me know what you thought about this show. I think it was a great show. But you guys are truly the ones who decide whether the show is great or not. And as I always say on this show, the one thing you can fucking do for me, just share the goddamn show. Share it. Let your friends know it's there. Because that's the only way we grow. You know what I mean? All right, so all that being said, we're going to get out of here. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see everybody here next week. Same bat time.